The gunshot that killed Violet's father echoed through the canyon 3 days before her hands started shaking, and by the time she reached Stillwater, Oklahoma, in late September of 1882, she could barely hold the reins of her borrowed mare without her fingers trembling like aspen leaves in a hard wind. She had ridden through territories she had no business crossing alone. A 22-year-old woman with nothing but a leather satchel containing her father's pocket watch, $43, and a letter of introduction to a lawyer she had never met. The morning she arrived, dust coated every inch of her navy traveling dress, and exhaustion had carved shadows beneath her green eyes that made her look like someone who had seen too much death in too short a time. The main street of Stillwater stretched before her like a ribbon of packed earth flanked by wooden buildings that leaned slightly. As if the Oklahoma wind had been pushing against them for so long, they had simply given up standing straight. A general store, a saloon, a bank with peeling white paint, a boarding house with a sign that swung on rusty hinges. Violet guided her horse toward what looked like a hotel, her body moving automatically because her mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Back to that moment when her father had gasped his last breath on the floor of their ranch house, while 3 men rode away with everything of value they could carry. She dismounted outside the Stillwater Hotel, her legs nearly buckling when her boots hit the ground. A man in a stained apron glanced at her from the doorway of what appeared to be a restaurant, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of a woman traveling alone, but he said nothing. Violet tied her horse and forced herself to walk toward the entrance, each step requiring more concentration than it should have. The shaking had started the morning after the funeral, just a slight tremor in her right hand that she had dismissed as fatigue. By the second day, both hands shook constantly, and by the third day she could barely button her own dress. The hotel lobby smelled of tobacco and old wood. A clerk with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a ledger, taking in her disheveled appearance with the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen plenty of desperate people pass through his establishment. "I need a room," Violet said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Just for a few nights while I settle my affairs." "That will be 50 cents a night, payable in advance," the clerk said. "We serve breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, no visitors after dark and no loud noises." Violet nodded and reached into her satchel, her hands shaking so badly that coins spilled across the counter and clattered onto the floor. She froze, staring at the scattered money, feeling heat rush to her cheeks. The clerk's expression shifted from neutral to concerned. "Are you all right, miss?" "I am fine," Violet lied, bending to retrieve the coins. Her fingers refused to close properly around them, and she had to try 3 times before she could pick up a single quarter. By the time she had gathered enough money to pay for 3 nights, humiliation burned in her throat like swallowed fire. The clerk tactfully said nothing as he handed her a key. "Room 7, top of the stairs and to the left. There is a wash basin and clean water. If you need anything, just come down." Violet climbed the stairs with the key clutched in both hands, afraid she would drop it. Room 7 was small and plain, containing a narrow bed, a chair, a table with a chipped porcelain basin, and a window that overlooked the street. She closed the door, turned the lock, and then stood in the middle of the room as the shaking intensified, spreading from her hands up her arms until her whole body trembled. She sank onto the bed and pressed her palms against her thighs, trying to will her muscles to stillness, but the trembling continued, relentless and terrifying. Her father had been shot by claim jumpers who wanted the silver deposit he had discovered on their small ranch outside of Silver City, New Mexico. The sheriff there had been sympathetic but useless, explaining that the men had probably already crossed into Texas or Arizona and would never be found. After the burial, neighbors had offered condolences but nothing substantial, and Violet had realized with cold clarity that she was entirely alone in the world except for her father's brother, whom she had never met but who supposedly lived somewhere near Stillwater and might, if she was lucky, offer her some form of assistance or guidance. She had sold everything that remained, bought passage on a stage part of the way, and ridden the rest, pushing herself and the horse to cover ground quickly because she could not afford to stay in hotels along the route. Now she was here, and her hands would not stop shaking, and she had no idea if her uncle even still lived at the address written on the decade-old letter her father had kept in his desk. That night, Violet did not sleep. She lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling while her body trembled, and her mind replayed the moment when she had found her father bleeding on the floor. When dawn light finally filtered through the thin curtains, she rose, attempted to wash her face and arrange her hair, and then went downstairs to find the lawyer whose name her father had mentioned once in passing as someone trustworthy. The law office of Samuel Hartford occupied a narrow building between the general store and a barber shop. Violet pushed open the door, triggering a bell that announced her arrival. A young man at a desk looked up, and behind him, an older gentleman with silver hair and a neat beard emerged from an inner office. "Can I help you, miss?" the older man asked. "My name is Violet Daniels," she said. "My father was Thomas Daniels from Silver City. He said if I ever needed legal help, I should find Samuel Hartford in Stillwater." Recognition flickered in the lawyer's eyes. "Thomas Daniels. I handled some property matters for him years ago when he lived in this area. Please come in and sit down." Violet followed him into the inner office, a cramped space lined with law books and filing cabinets. She sat in the chair he offered, folding her shaking hands in her lap and hoping he would not notice. "What brings you here, Miss Daniels?" Hartford asked gently. "Your father is not with you." "He was murdered 3 weeks ago," Violet said, and saying it aloud made it real in a way that nothing else had. "3 men came to our ranch and shot him for the silver claim he had filed. I buried him, sold what I could, and came here to find my uncle, Joseph Daniels. My father said his brother settled somewhere near Stillwater, but I have only an old address and no certainty that he is still alive or still here." Hartford's expression grew somber. "I am deeply sorry for your loss. Joseph Daniels, you said. Let me check my records. If he owns property in this county, I will have documentation." He rose and began pulling ledgers from a shelf, flipping through pages while Violet sat rigidly in her chair, using all her concentration to keep her hands still. After several minutes, Hartford paused, his finger on a page. "Joseph Daniels purchased land about 8 miles northeast of town in 1878. According to the tax records, he still owns it, though I have not seen him personally in over a year. He keeps to himself, as I recall." Relief washed through Violet so powerfully that her vision blurred. "Can you tell me how to find the property?" "I can draw you a map," Hartford said. "But Miss Daniels, are you certain you are well enough to travel? You look as though you have been through a terrible ordeal." "I need to find my uncle," Violet said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "He is the only family I have left." Hartford drew a simple map on a piece of paper, marking the roads and landmarks that would lead her to Joseph Daniels's property. As he handed it to her, his eyes dropped to her trembling hands, and concern deepened the lines around his mouth. "Miss Daniels, I do not wish to overstep, but you should see a doctor. There is a physician 2 streets over, Dr. Brennan, who is quite capable." Violet took the map, folding it carefully. "I appreciate your concern, but I cannot afford a doctor right now. Once I have spoken with my uncle and determined my situation, perhaps then. She left the office before Hartford could press the issue, stepping back into the bright morning sunlight. The town had come alive while she was inside, with wagons rolling down the street and people going about their business. Violet walked back to the hotel, retrieved her horse, and set out northeast following the map, her body still trembling but her determination overriding her physical weakness. The ride took longer than it should have, because Violet had to stop twice to rest, sitting on rocks by the side of the rough trail while her horse grazed nearby. The Oklahoma landscape rolled around her in gentle hills covered with prairie grass and scattered stands of trees, the sky an endless blue dome overhead. It was beautiful in a stark way, so different from the New Mexico mountains, where she had grown up, that it felt like entering a foreign country. She found the property just after noon, a modest homestead with a small house, a barn, and several corrals containing horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as Violet rode into the yard, a man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and a weathered face that bore a strong resemblance to her father. When he saw her, he stopped abruptly, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock. "You are Thomas's girl," he said, and it was not a question. "You look just like your mother." Violet dismounted, her legs unsteady. "Uncle Joseph, I am Violet. I came because my father is dead and I have nowhere else to go." Joseph Daniels crossed the distance between them in quick strides, catching her elbow when she swayed. "Come inside. You look half dead yourself." He led her into the house, a simple structure with a main room containing a table, chairs, a stove, and a few personal items. Joseph guided her to a chair and then poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup, setting it on the table in front of her. Violet reached for it, but her hands shook so violently that water sloshed over the rim before she could bring it to her lips. "What is wrong with you?" Joseph asked bluntly. "Are you sick?" "I do not know," Violet admitted, setting the cup down before she dropped it. "It started after the funeral. I cannot make it stop." Joseph studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Tell me what happened to Thomas." Violet told him everything, the words spilling out in a rush now that she had someone to tell. She described the claim jumpers, the sheriff's indifference, the desperate rush to sell everything and travel here. Joseph listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each detail. When she finished, he said, "You can stay here as long as you need. I have a spare room and I could use help around the place if you are able. But first, we need to figure out what is wrong with you. Tomorrow, I will take you to a man I know who might be able to help." "I cannot afford a doctor," Violet said quietly. "This man is not exactly a doctor, but he knows healing," Joseph replied. "He works at the ranch next to mine. Name is Dalton Lawson. He has a way with animals and people both, learned from his mother who was a healer. If anyone can help, it will be him." Violet wanted to argue, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. Joseph showed her to a small bedroom with a simple bed, and she collapsed onto it, falling into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. She woke to the smell of cooking meat and realized with surprise that evening had fallen. Her body still trembled, but the edge of panic had dulled slightly. She rose, splashed water on her face from the basin Joseph had left on a stand, and went out to the main room where her uncle was dishing stew into bowls. They ate together in near silence, Joseph occasionally asking gentle questions about her father and her life in New Mexico. Violet answered as best she could, but exhaustion made her words slow and halting. After dinner, Joseph insisted she return to bed, and she obeyed without protest. The next morning dawned clear and cool, autumn making its presence known in the crisp air. Joseph had breakfast ready when Violet emerged from her room, and after they ate, he saddled 2 horses and helped Violet mount hers. They rode east across the prairie, following a fence line that marked the boundary between properties. The neighboring ranch was larger than Joseph's, with a well-maintained house, a sizable barn, and multiple outbuildings. Several horses moved in a large corral, and as Violet and Joseph rode into the yard, a man emerged from the barn leading a bay mare. He was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of weathered denim. He wore work clothes, simple pants and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his boots were scuffed from hard use. When he saw Joseph, his face broke into a smile that transformed his features from handsome to striking. "Joseph, you are out and about early," the man said, his voice a low drawl that carried easily across the yard. Then his gaze shifted to Violet and the smile faded into curiosity. "Who is this?" "My niece, Violet Daniels," Joseph said, dismounting. "She arrived yesterday from New Mexico with bad news and worse health. I hoped you might take a look at her." Dalton Lawson tied the bay mare to a post and walked toward them, his movements economical and graceful. He looked up at Violet, who still sat on her horse, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "What seems to be the trouble?" he asked. Violet opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment her horse shifted beneath her, and she instinctively reached for the saddle horn to steady herself. Her hands shook so badly that she could not grip properly, and she felt herself sliding sideways. Before she could fall, Dalton moved with startling speed, reaching up to catch her waist and ease her down from the saddle. His hands were warm and strong through the fabric of her dress, and when he set her on her feet, he kept one hand on her arm to steady her. "Easy," he said quietly. "When did the shaking start?" 3 days after my father died," Violet said, hating how weak her voice sounded. "I cannot make it stop." Dalton's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. He released her arm but stayed close, clearly ready to catch her again if necessary. "Come inside. Let me examine you properly." He led the way to the house, Joseph following behind with Violet between them. The interior was neat and comfortable, with furniture that looked handmade but well-crafted. Dalton guided Violet to a chair at the kitchen table and then moved to the stove, where a pot of coffee sat warming. He poured a cup and brought it to her, setting it on the table. "Try to drink some," he said. Violet reached for the cup with both hands, but the moment she lifted it, coffee sloshed over the rim and onto the table. She tried again, gripping harder, but her hands would not cooperate. Frustration and humiliation burned in her chest, and tears pricked at her eyes. "I cannot," she whispered. Dalton crouched beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "It is all right. Let me help." He reached out and wrapped his hands around hers, his palms rough with calluses but gentle in their pressure. His hands completely engulfed hers, steadying the trembling enough that he could guide the cup to her lips. Violet took a sip, the hot coffee flooding her mouth with bitter warmth. Dalton waited patiently, his eyes on her face, and then helped her take another sip and another, his presence so calm and unhurried that some of the tension in Violet's shoulders began to ease. When she had drunk half the cup, he lowered it back to the table, but he did not immediately release her hands. Instead, he turned them gently, examining them as though looking for injury. "There is no physical damage," he said quietly. "This is shock. Your body has been pushed beyond what it can handle and it is rebelling. Have you been eating? Sleeping?" "Not much," Violet admitted. "I was trying to get here as quickly as possible." Dalton released her hands and stood, turning to Joseph. "She needs rest, real rest, not just a night or two. She needs regular meals and time to let her mind process what happened." The shaking will ease when her body believes it is safe again. How long will that take? Violet asked. It depends on you, Dalton said. For some people a few weeks, for others longer, but you cannot rush it. Violet felt despair settle over her like a heavy blanket. I cannot afford weeks of doing nothing. I need to find work to make a living somehow. Joseph and Dalton exchanged a glance, and then Joseph said, "You will stay with me. I already told you that. As for work, there is plenty to do around my place once you are well enough. For now, you rest." "I can check on her regularly," Dalton added. "Make sure she is improving. No charge, Joseph. This is what neighbors do." Violet wanted to protest, to insist that she could manage on her own, but the truth was that she could not manage anything in her current state. She nodded mutely, accepting their help because she had no other choice. Over the following days, a routine established itself. Joseph treated Violet like a daughter, cooking meals and insisting she eat even when she had no appetite. He talked to her about his life in Oklahoma, about the horses he raised and sold, about the quiet satisfaction of working land that belonged to him. Violet listened and gradually began to talk as well, sharing memories of her father and the life they had built in New Mexico. Dalton came by every other day, always in the afternoon after his own work was done. He would sit with Violet at the table, helping her drink coffee or water, his hand steadying hers with a patience that never seemed to waver. He asked gentle questions about how she was feeling, whether she was sleeping, whether the shaking had eased at all. Mostly, though, he just talked, filling the silence with stories about the horses he trained, the land around Stillwater, the quirks of the people who lived in the area. Violet found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that surprised her. There was something about Dalton that made her feel safe, a quiet competence in the way he moved and spoke that suggested nothing could shake him. He never treated her trembling hands as though they were strange or pitiable, just as a temporary condition that would pass. When he helped her drink, his touch was so matter-of-fact that the humiliation she had felt initially began to fade, replaced by a tentative gratitude. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Dalton came by and found Violet sitting outside on a bench Joseph had built near the house. The October air was cool but pleasant, and the prairie stretched around them in shades of gold and brown. Dalton sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "How are you today?" he asked. "A little better," Violet said, and it was true. The shaking had lessened slightly, and she had managed to eat breakfast without spilling too much. "Joseph is in town buying supplies. He said he would be back by evening." Dalton nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "Joseph is a good man." "Your father must have been a good man, too, to raise a daughter like you." Violet felt warmth flood her cheeks. "You do not know me well enough to say that. I know you rode alone across dangerous country to reach the only family you had left," Dalton said quietly. "I know you did not fall apart even though you had every right to. I know you are stronger than you think." Violet looked at him, really looked at him, and saw sincerity in his eyes. "I do not feel strong. I feel broken." "Broken things can heal," Dalton said. "Sometimes they heal stronger than before." They sat in silence for a while, the wind stirring the grass and carrying the distant sound of birdsong. Finally, Violet said, "Why do you help me? You do not know me either." Dalton was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My mother died when I was 15. She was thrown from a horse and broke her neck. For months after, I had nightmares every night, and my hands would shake whenever I tried to ride. My father did not understand, thought I was being weak. But there was a man who worked on a neighboring ranch who had been in the war and seen terrible things. He recognized what was happening to me. He took the time to sit with me, to teach me how to ride again without fear, to show me that what I was feeling was not weakness but a normal response to losing someone I loved. He saved me, in a way. When I see someone struggling the way you are, I remember what he did for me, and I want to do the same. Violet felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had lived there since her father's death. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me, for not making me feel ashamed." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Dalton said firmly. He stood and extended his hand. "Come on, let me show you something." Violet hesitated, then placed her trembling hand in his. He pulled her gently to her feet and led her toward the barn. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of hay and horses. Dalton walked to a stall at the far end where a gray mare stood with a foal pressed against her side. The foal was small and wobbly, clearly only a few days old. "She was born 3 days ago," Dalton said quietly. "The birth was hard, and we thought we might lose both of them. But the mare kept fighting, kept pushing, and the foal came into the world alive and healthy. Now look at them." Violet looked. The mare was nuzzling her foal, her eyes soft with contentment. The foal was nursing, its tiny tail flicking with satisfaction. "Life is resilient," Dalton said. "Even when things seem impossible, even when the struggle seems too hard, life finds a way to continue. You will too." Violet felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were not tears of despair. They were something else, something closer to release. Dalton did not comment on them, just stood beside her while she cried quietly, his presence solid and reassuring. As the weeks passed, Violet's condition slowly improved. The shaking lessened day by day until it was only a slight tremor in her fingers, and then even that began to fade. She started helping Joseph with small tasks around the property, feeding the horses, mending tack, sweeping the house. Her appetite returned, and with it, a bit of color in her cheeks. Joseph watched her progress with satisfaction, telling her often that she looked more like herself every day. Though he had never known her before her father's death, and had no idea what herself had looked like, Dalton continued his visits, but their nature changed subtly. He no longer came to check on her health, but to simply spend time with her. They would sit on the bench outside or walk around Joseph's property, talking about everything and nothing. Violet learned that Dalton had inherited his ranch from his father, who had died 2 years earlier from pneumonia. She learned that he loved working with horses, that he could gentle the wildest Mustang with patience and understanding, that he dreamed of expanding his ranch and breeding horses that would be known throughout the territory for their quality. Dalton learned that Violet had helped her father run their ranch, that she knew how to shoot, how to track game, how to read weather in the sky and water in the land. He learned that she loved reading, that she had a small collection of books she had brought with her and treasured above almost all her other possessions. He learned that she laughed rarely but beautifully, and that when she did, it lit up her entire face. One evening in late November, as the first real cold of winter began to settle over the prairie, Dalton came by and found Violet alone. Joseph had ridden to a neighbor's property to look at a horse he was considering buying and would not be back until the next day. Violet invited Dalton inside, and they sat at the kitchen table while she made coffee. Her hands were almost completely steady now, and she poured 2 cups without spilling a drop. Dalton noticed and smiled. "You have come a long way," he said. "Thanks to you," Violet replied, setting a cup in front of him. "I do not think I would have recovered without your help." Dalton shook his head. "You would have. It might have taken longer, but you would have found your way through. You are too strong not to." Violet sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around her own cup. "I have been thinking about what comes next. I cannot stay with Joseph forever, even though he has been incredibly generous. I need to figure out how to support myself." "What do you want to do?" Dalton asked. I do not know, Violet admitted. In New Mexico, I helped my father with the ranch, but I do not have the money to buy my own property. I thought perhaps I could find work in town, maybe at the general store or the hotel. Dalton was quiet for a moment, his eyes on his coffee. Then he said, I have a proposition for you if you would consider it. Violet looked at him curiously. What kind of proposition? I need help at my ranch, Dalton said. The work has gotten to be more than I can handle alone, especially now that I am taking on more horses to train. I can offer you a job, fair wages, and a place to stay in the spare room in my house. It would be respectable. Joseph is right next door, and everyone in the area knows and trusts me. You would be working, not dependent on anyone's charity. Violet felt her heart begin to beat faster. The idea of working on Dalton's ranch, of seeing him every day, filled her with an emotion she was not quite ready to name. But there was also hesitation, awareness of what people might say about a single woman living under the same roof as a single man. What would people think? She asked quietly. People will think what they want to think regardless of what we do, Dalton said. But anyone who knows me knows I would never do anything to compromise a woman's reputation. And if it would make you more comfortable, we can make sure there are always others around. I employ 2 men who come during the day to help with the heavy work. You would never be alone with me unless you chose to be. Violet considered this. The offer was generous, more generous than she had any right to expect. And the truth was, she wanted to work with horses, wanted to be outside doing physical labor that made sense, wanted to be near Dalton even though she was afraid to examine why that mattered so much. I accept, she said finally, but only if you promise to tell me if I am not pulling my weight. I will not be a burden. Dalton's face broke into a smile that made Violet's breath catch. You could never be a burden. When can you start? Whenever you need me, Violet said. Tomorrow, Dalton suggested. I have 3 new horses arriving that will need settling in. Tomorrow, Violet agreed. That night, she lay in bed in Joseph's spare room and tried to understand what was happening to her. She had come to Stillwater broken and terrified, barely able to function. Now, less than 2 months later, she was recovering, planning for the future, and feeling things for Dalton Lawson that went far beyond gratitude. He was kind and patient, yes, but he was also strong and capable, with a gentleness in his hands that made her wonder what it would feel like to be held by him, to be touched with intention rather than simply steadied. She pushed the thought away, telling herself it was too soon, that she was confused, that what she felt was probably just the result of his kindness during her lowest moment. But the thought returned, persistent and undeniable, and she fell asleep with his name on her lips. The next morning, Joseph helped her move her few belongings to Dalton's ranch. Dalton showed her the spare room, which was clean and comfortable with a real bed frame and a handmade quilt. The window looked east, and morning light would flood in, warming the space. Violet set her satchel on the bed and turned to find Dalton watching her from the doorway. "Will this work?" he asked. "It is perfect," Violet said honestly. They spent the day working side by side. The 3 horses that arrived were young geldings, not yet broken to saddle, full of energy and suspicion. Dalton moved among them with calm confidence, speaking in a low voice that seemed to ease their fear. Violet watched and learned, helping when he directed her, staying back when he needed space to work. By evening, the horses were settled in their stalls, and Violet was exhausted in a way that felt good, her muscles tired from honest work. Dalton cooked dinner, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and they ate together at the kitchen table. The 2 ranch hands he had mentioned, a father and son named Pike and Samuel, had left for the day, riding back to their own property several miles away. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire in the stove and the distant sound of horses moving in the barn. "Thank you for today," Dalton said. "You were a real help." "I liked it," Violet admitted. "It felt good to work with animals again." "Your father taught you well," Dalton observed. "He did," Violet said softly. "I miss him every day, but it does not hurt as sharply as it did." "It will always hurt," Dalton said quietly, "but the hurt becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you." Violet nodded, understanding what he meant. They finished eating in comfortable silence, and then Violet helped wash the dishes before retreating to her room. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of Dalton moving around the house, and felt something she had not felt since before her father's death, a sense of being home. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to their days. Violet rose early, helped Dalton with the morning feeding and chores, then worked alongside him training the horses. She discovered she had a knack for the work, a patience and intuition that Dalton praised. He taught her techniques his mother had taught him, ways of reading a horse's body language, of moving with the animal rather than against it. They worked well together, their movements becoming synchronized, their communication often wordless. Pike and Samuel came most days, taking care of the heavier tasks like mending fences and hauling hay. They treated Violet with respect, and if they had any opinions about her living at Dalton's ranch, they kept them to themselves. Joseph visited frequently, often staying for dinner, his presence providing the chaperone that propriety demanded, even though Violet was beginning not to care what anyone thought, because the truth was, she was falling in love with Dalton Lawson. It happened slowly, then all at once. It was in the way he laughed at something she said, his whole body relaxing with genuine amusement. It was in the way he handed her tools before she asked for them, anticipating her needs. It was in the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching, his eyes full of something that made her heart race. It was in the way he still helped her with coffee on the rare mornings when her hands trembled slightly, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Winter settled over Oklahoma with cold winds and occasional snow. Violet had been at Dalton's ranch for 3 months, and Christmas was approaching. Joseph invited them both to spend Christmas Day with him, and Violet agreed, though she felt a pang at the thought of celebrating without her father. On Christmas Eve, she and Dalton worked late finishing chores, then came inside to find the house blessedly warm. Dalton had brought in a small pine tree and set it in the corner, and together they decorated it with strings of popcorn and a few tin ornaments he had owned for years. When they finished, Dalton poured them each a small glass of whiskey, and they sat by the fire, looking at the tree. "My father always said Christmas was a time to remember what matters," Violet said quietly. "Family, faith, the people who stand beside you when everything falls apart." "He sounds like he was a wise man," Dalton said. "He was," Violet agreed. She turned to look at Dalton, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "You have been one of those people for me, Dalton. You stood beside me when I had nothing and no one. I will never forget that." Dalton set his glass down and turned to face her fully. "Violet, I need to tell you something, and I hope it will not make things awkward between us." Violet's heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I did not offer you this job just because you needed help," Dalton said slowly. "I mean, that was part of it, but not all. The truth is, from the first moment I saw you, even shaking and exhausted and barely able to stand, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. And as I have gotten to know you, as I have watched you heal and grow strong again, I have come to care for you in a way that goes far beyond friendship or neighborly concern. I am in love with you, Violet. I have been for weeks now. I understand if you do not feel the same, if this is too soon or too much. I just needed you to know." Violet stared at him, her mind reeling. Then, slowly, she set her own glass down and reached out, placing her hand on his. Her fingers were steady, not a single tremor. "Dalton," she said softly, "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the day you helped me drink coffee, when you treated my weakness as though it was just a temporary inconvenience rather than something shameful. You made me feel safe when I did not think I would ever feel safe again. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left. I love you, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Dalton's eyes searched hers as though looking for any sign of doubt. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle and tentative at first, a question more than a statement. Violet answered by leaning into him, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders. The kiss deepened, and Violet felt warmth spread through her entire body, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man holding her. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Dalton rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, I know we have not been courting in any traditional sense, but I do not want to wait. I want to spend my life with you, Violet. Say yes." Violet laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Dalton kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation, only certainty and passion. They sat by the fire until late into the night, making plans and dreaming about the future they would build together. The wedding took place in late January of 1883, a small ceremony in the Stillwater church with Joseph standing as witness and a handful of neighbors in attendance. Violet wore a simple blue dress that she had bought in town with money she had saved from her wages, and Dalton wore his best suit, looking handsome enough to make Violet's breath catch when she saw him waiting at the altar. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about the challenges they would face and the strength they would find in each other. And when Dalton slipped a gold ring onto Violet's finger, she felt as though every piece of her broken life had finally come together into something whole and beautiful. The reception was held at Joseph's house, with food and music and dancing that lasted until well after dark. Violet danced with Dalton, with Joseph, with Pike and Samuel and several other men from neighboring ranches. She laughed until her sides ached, and when Dalton finally swept her into his arms and carried her out to his wagon to take her home, she felt happier than she had ever thought possible. Their first night as husband and wife was tender and full of discovery. Dalton was patient and gentle, taking his time to learn what made Violet gasp and sigh, and Violet found a confidence in her own body that she had not known she possessed. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Dalton's bed, now their bed, and talked until sleep claimed them. The months that followed were full of hard work and deep contentment. Violet and Dalton worked the ranch together, building it into one of the most respected horse breeding operations in the territory. They added more horses, expanded the barn, and hired another hand to help with the increasing workload. Joseph remained a constant presence in their lives, often joining them for Sunday dinners and offering advice when asked. In the fall of 1883, Violet discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton on a crisp October evening, and he responded by picking her up and spinning her in a circle, his face alight with joy. He became even more protective of her than usual, insisting she take on lighter tasks and rest more often. Violet indulged him because she could see how much it meant to him, but she also continued to work because sitting idle made her restless. Their son was born in May of 1884, a healthy baby with dark hair and his father's blue eyes. They named him Thomas, after Violet's father, and Joseph cried when they told him. Baby Thomas was a good-natured child, curious and alert, and both Violet and Dalton doted on him. Watching Dalton hold their son, speaking to him in that same low, gentle voice he used with horses, made Violet fall in love with him all over again. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The ranch prospered, and their reputation for quality horses spread. People came from as far as Texas and Kansas to buy from them, and Dalton's skill at training became legendary in the area. Violet managed the business side of things, keeping careful records and negotiating sales with a shrewdness that impressed everyone who dealt with her. In the summer of 1886, Violet gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose. She had Violet's green eyes and a determined personality that made her parents laugh. Thomas, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and would sit for hours just watching her. The house was full of noise and laughter, a far cry from the silent grief that had consumed Violet when she first arrived in Stillwater. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while their children played in the yard, Dalton turned to Violet and said, "Do you remember the day we met, when you could barely hold a coffee cup?" Violet smiled. "I remember. I thought I would never be whole again." "And now look at you," Dalton said, reaching over to take her hand. "Strong, capable, running a successful ranch and raising 2 beautiful children. I am so proud of you, Violet." "I could not have done any of it without you," Violet said softly. "You saved me, Dalton." "We saved each other," Dalton corrected. "I was alone, going through the motions of living but not really alive. You gave me purpose again, gave me a reason to build something meaningful. You are my everything, Violet, you and the children." Violet leaned over and kissed him, a kiss full of the love and gratitude and passion that had only deepened over the years. When she pulled back, she rested her head on his shoulder, watching Thomas chase Rose around the yard while the sky turned shades of gold and pink. "I am happy," she said simply. "I did not think I would ever be happy again after my father died, but I am so happy." "Good," Dalton said, wrapping his arm around her. "You deserve to be happy. You deserve all the good things life has to offer." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the sounds of their children's laughter mixing with the evening birdsong. Inside the house, dinner waited, and after they ate, they would put the children to bed and then retire to their own room, where they would make love and talk and fall asleep in each other's arms, as they did every night. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved horses as much as his father did. Rose was wild and fearless, always getting into mischief and charming her way out of trouble. In 1889, Violet gave birth to another son whom they named James, and in 1892, a second daughter named Clara arrived. The ranch house, which had once seemed so spacious, now rang with the constant noise of 4 children, and Violet and Dalton had to expand it, adding rooms and a larger kitchen. Joseph grew older but remained vigorous, spending most of his days at Violet and Dalton's ranch, teaching his grandnephews and grandnieces everything he knew about horses and land. He became a beloved figure to the children, always ready with a story or a piece of candy hidden in his pocket. When he died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1895, the entire family mourned, but they also celebrated the full life he had lived and the impact he had made on all of them. They buried him on his property, beneath a large oak tree, and Dalton inherited the land, which he merged with his own, creating one of the largest ranches in the area. As the new century approached, Violet and Dalton found themselves entering middle age with a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. Their children were thriving. The ranch was more successful than they had ever dreamed, and their love for each other had only grown stronger with time. They had weathered droughts and harsh winters, illnesses and injuries, but they had always faced these challenges together, united in their commitment to each other and their family. One spring morning in 1899, Violet stood in the kitchen making coffee, her movements automatic after so many years. Dalton came in from the barn, his hair now touched with gray at the temples, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Good morning, Mrs. Lawson," he murmured. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," Violet replied, leaning back against him. "The coffee is almost ready." "I do not care about the coffee," Dalton said. "I just wanted to hold you." Violet turned in his arms, looking up at him. "You can hold me any time you want." "I know," Dalton said, smiling, "but I never take it for granted. Every day I wake up with you beside me is a gift." "You are getting sentimental in your old age," Violet teased. "I am not old," Dalton protested. "I am mature and distinguished." Violet laughed, the sound bright and carefree. "Whatever you say, dear." They poured coffee and sat together at the table, as they did every morning, discussing the day's work and the needs of the children and the state of the ranch. It was a ritual they both cherished, this quiet time before the chaos of the day began. Thomas, now 15, came in looking for breakfast, followed shortly by Rose at 13, James at 10, and Clara at 7. The kitchen filled with noise and motion, and Violet moved among her children with practiced ease, making sure everyone was fed and ready for the day. Dalton caught her eye across the table and winked, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest that still happened after all these years. Later that day, after the children had scattered to their various tasks and lessons, Violet walked out to the barn where Dalton was working with a new horse, a spirited mare that would fetch a good price once she was trained. She leaned against the fence, watching him work, marveling at the way he seemed to communicate with the animal without words. When he finished and the mare was settled, Dalton walked over to Violet, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What brings you out here?" he asked. "I was just thinking," Violet said, "about how far we have come. Do you remember when I could not even hold a coffee cup without your help?" Dalton's expression softened. "I remember. I also remember thinking that I would do anything to help you, even though I barely knew you." "Why?" Violet asked. "Why did you care so much about a stranger?" Dalton considered this for a moment. "I think part of me recognized you even then. Recognized that you were someone important, someone who would change my life. Maybe it sounds foolish, but I believe we were meant to find each other." "I believe that too," Violet said quietly. "I think my father's death, as terrible as it was, led me to exactly where I needed to be. It led me to Joseph and to you and to this life we have built. I would not change any of it, even the painful parts, because they brought me here." Dalton reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "I love you, Violet. I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Violet whispered. "Always." They stood there in the Oklahoma sunshine, holding each other, while around them the ranch bustled with life and purpose. The horses moved in their corrals, the children's voices carried on the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried as it circled in the blue expanse of sky. The years continued their relentless march forward. Thomas grew into a fine young man and took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch, showing a natural aptitude for business and horsemanship. Rose married a neighboring rancher's son in 1902, a good man who loved her fierce spirit, and they settled on land adjacent to Violet and Dalton's property. James decided he wanted to be a veterinarian and went east to study, writing long letters home that Violet treasured. Clara remained at home the longest, helping her mother with the household and learning everything she could about running a ranch. In 1910, Thomas married a sweet-natured woman named Elizabeth, and they gave Violet and Dalton their first grandchild, a boy named David, in 1911. Rose followed with twin girls in 1912. The house that had once been so full of their own children now filled with grandchildren, and Violet found joy in watching Dalton play with them, seeing him pass on the same gentle wisdom he had shown their own children. As they entered their 50s, and then their 60s, Violet and Dalton began to slow down, allowing their children to take on more of the work while they supervised and advised. They spent more time together, taking long walks around the property, sitting on the porch in the evenings, traveling occasionally to visit James in his veterinary practice or Clara, who had moved to Kansas with her husband. But through it all, their love remained constant. Dalton still helped Violet with her coffee sometimes, not because she needed it, but because they both remembered that first time, when she had been shaking too hard to hold the cup, and he had steadied her hands and helped her drink. It had become a symbol of their relationship, that moment of vulnerability and care, and they cherished it. On their 30th wedding anniversary, in January of 1913, their children threw them a party that drew people from all over the territory. The house overflowed with friends and neighbors, all eager to celebrate the couple who had become pillars of the community. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and music, and through it all, Violet and Dalton sat together, hands intertwined, surrounded by the family they had built and the life they had created. When the party finally wound down and the last guests had departed, Violet and Dalton stood on their porch looking out at the land that had become so familiar and beloved. 30 years, Violet mused. It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. Best 30 years of my life, Dalton said firmly. Every single day with you has been a gift. Even the hard days, Violet asked with a smile. Especially the hard days, Dalton replied, because we faced them together and we came out stronger. Violet turned to face him, reaching up to touch his face, now lined with age but still handsome to her eyes. I used to wonder if I would ever be whole again after my father died, after everything that happened. But you taught me that wholeness does not mean going back to who you were before. It means becoming someone new, someone shaped by both the pain and the love. You taught me the same thing, Dalton said. I was just going through the motions before you came into my life. You gave me purpose, passion, a reason to build something that mattered. You gave me everything. They kissed then, a kiss full of 30 years of history and devotion, of challenges overcome and dreams fulfilled. When they pulled apart, they went inside together, to the bed they had shared for 3 decades, and made love with the tenderness and familiarity of long practice. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the inevitable changes that time brings. Violet's hair turned completely silver, and Dalton developed a limp from an old injury that flared up in cold weather. But their minds remained sharp, and their love remained unwavering. In the spring of 1920, they celebrated their 65th birthdays within a month of each other. The ranch was now run entirely by Thomas and his children, with input from Violet and Dalton when requested. They had moved into a smaller house on the property, a cottage that Dalton had built specifically for their retirement, with a wide porch that faced the sunrise and a garden where Violet grew vegetables and flowers. They spent their days quietly, reading and gardening and watching their great-grandchildren play. There were 9 of them now, ranging from infants to teenagers, and they brought constant joy and energy to the family. Violet loved watching Dalton with the youngest ones, seeing him teach them about horses and land and life with the same patient kindness he had shown her so many years ago. One summer evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Violet said, "Dalton, I want you to know that I have no regrets, not one. Every choice I made, every path I took led me to you and to this life. I could not have asked for anything more." Dalton took her hand, his grip still strong despite the tremor of age. "I feel the same, my love. You turned my world from black and white into color. You gave me a reason to wake up every morning with joy in my heart. I have been blessed beyond measure." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Inside the main house, lights glowed warm and welcoming, and they could hear the faint sounds of family gathering for dinner. Soon, someone would come to fetch them, and they would join the gathering, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them part of the legacy that Violet and Dalton had built. "You remember," Violet said softly, "that day when I could not hold my coffee cup? When you steadied my hands and helped me drink?" "I remember," Dalton said. "I remember thinking that I would do anything to help you, to ease your pain." "You did more than that," Violet said. "You gave me back my life. You gave me hope when I had none. You loved me when I could not love myself." "And you did the same for me," Dalton replied. "We saved each other, Violet. That is what love does." Violet squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar contours of his palm against hers as known to her as her own heartbeat. "I love you, Dalton Lawson. I have loved you for nearly 40 years, and I will love you for whatever time we have left." "I love you too, Violet Lawson," Dalton said. "Always and forever." They sat together as night fell completely, wrapped in the blanket of stars and the warmth of their enduring love. And when Thomas came to call them for dinner, they rose together, supporting each other as they always had, and walked hand in hand toward the light and laughter of their family, toward the life they had built together from the ashes of tragedy and the foundation of love. In the years that followed, they continued to live in their cottage, growing older but never apart. When Dalton's health began to fail in 1924, Violet cared for him with the same devotion he had shown her at the beginning. She was there when he passed peacefully in his sleep one October night, holding his hand and whispering words of love until his last breath. The grief was profound, but Violet did not fall apart. She had learned, so many years ago, that she was stronger than she thought, that broken things could heal. She mourned deeply, but she also celebrated the incredible life they had shared, the love that had sustained them both. She lived for 3 more years, surrounded by family, sharing stories of Dalton and their life together with anyone who would listen. She told her grandchildren and great-grandchildren about the day she had arrived in Stillwater, shaking too hard to hold a coffee cup, and how a cowboy had steadied her hands and changed her life forever. She told them that love was the most powerful force in the world, that it could heal wounds and build dreams and create miracles. When Violet died peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1927, she was buried beside Dalton on the ranch they had built together. The entire community came to pay their respects, filling the cemetery with flowers and tears and stories of the remarkable couple who had loved so deeply and lived so well. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren continued to run the ranch, keeping alive the legacy of quality and integrity that Violet and Dalton had established. The story of their love became family legend, passed down through generations as an example of how two people could find each other at the darkest moment and build something beautiful together. And somewhere in the Oklahoma prairie, where the wind still blows across the grass and the sky stretches endless and blue, the spirit of their love endures, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of commitment, and the healing grace of a cowboy who steadied a trembling woman's hands and helped her drink, and in doing so, gave her everything.